So my theme, logos, the mystery of how we make sense of the world. Ambitious or what? And let me just step back a little bit and think about what the nature of philosophy is. And it seems to me that one of the roles of philosophy, or the central role of philosophy, has been to make the profound mystery of humanity visible. And that's not just a role for philosophy. As far as I'm concerned, in all the various genres that I've worked in, written in, and so on, that has been a central theme. To make clear our unique nature. My latest book, which hasn't been published yet, is called Reclaiming Humanity from God and Science. And I'm a humanist. Well, humanists think they've done the business when they've been rude about religion. I don't think they have. But I think they've got to be equally rude, in fact more intelligently rude, about naturalism as well, and we'll come to reasons for that in due course. So the role, it seems to me, of anybody who is a serious thinker in the present age is to create an overture to a philosophy of humanism that goes beyond the mere rejection of religion. In my time, I've been guilty of many sins: poetry, philosophy, essays, and fiction. All have been different ways of trying to grapple with the curious creatures that we are, utterly unique in the universe. More focusing specifically on philosophy, it seems to be that it has several roles, but they really are connected. The first is to learn how to untake the taken for granted, to unpeel our gaze, to learn to be asked by questions. And then, of course, to disagree with other philosophers. And many people think that's the whole business with philosophy, is the more sort of, scratching each other's eyes out and so on and so forth. But actually, that is very much a secondary business of philosophy. In many ways, although they may disagree, it is the mission that is more important than perhaps the different ways in which they deliver on it. We should be more astonished at ourselves than we are. I have to say I'm only intermittently astonished at myself. I'm embarrassed by myself and so on and so forth. But astonished, it is more intermittent than I think should be the case. And of course, one should be more astonished at the world. So that's a little bit of background. And when I talk about the fact that we make sense of the world, it's important to realize that our making sense of the world at the level of reason is a fairly late entry. And many other things have to be in place before we get to reason, premises, arguments, conclusions, and so on and so forth. The sort of thing that you specifically associate with philosophy. If A, then B, and so on and so forth. What I'm going to say is based on the last book called Logos, The Mystery of How We Make Sense of the World. And it has been driven by this central thought from Einstein, who said that the eternal mystery of the world is its comprehensibility, the fact that we can make sense of it. After all, think about our heads, our little pinprick bonzes. They have apparently got true things to say about the universe. But let's just stand back and remind ourselves that our heads have a volume of about 4 litres, unless you're a politician, in which case it's 8 litres. But generally, that's the sort of size of our heads. What about the universe we talk about? It has 4 times 10 to the power 23 cubic light years. So our heads utter the word universe and put the universe in inverted commas. And that is an extraordinary fact about ourselves, the eternal mystery. And we can make that mystery a little bit clearer if we think about some of the things that philosophers have said about how it is that we actually make sense of the world. And I just want to focus on one particular example. This is the great philosopher WILLIAN van Orman Quine, who was an American philosopher who strode the word like a colossus in the 20th century. And he said, the question is this: how is it that we, physical denizens of the physical world, can have developed a scientific theory of that whole world from our meager contacts with it, from the mere impacts of rays and particles on our surfaces, and a few odds and ends, such as a strain of walking uphill? That's the raw material with which we're initially working with as human beings, human organisms. So there is a long and winding path from our sense experience, such as Quine has described it, to theories of almost, or not quite, everything. And I want to just pause a little bit to look at some of the steps in that long and winding path. The step from sense experience to our intuition of objects that exist independent of my experience. So when I'm looking at this lectern, for example, not only am I experiencing it in a certain way, I am experiencing it as something that transcends my experience of it. It is more than my experience of it. The next step is that we collect objects, and indeed events that involve objects, under general categories: lectern, stone, tree, so on and so forth. And then, most extraordinary, we separate those classes, those general categories, from their instances. So we have a concept of rain that already is a long way from the experience of getting wet. Armed with all that, we observe general patterns. And we start ascribing intrinsic properties to what is out there. We have a sense of forces, modes of interaction, universal laws, and so on. And we arrive at those laws connecting what we think are the intrinsic properties of objects or of events. And on the basis of that, we start identifying hidden forces. The most universal is that of causation. The nature of causation is highly contested by many philosophers. David Hume famously questioned whether causation was anything other than the way things simply occurred in a concurrent way, that there was things happened, there were habits of the universe. But anyway, we have a sense of things causing things, not only in our own experience, but throughout the totality of possible experience, throughout the totality of the universe, beyond actual or indeed possible experience. We have the idea of other forces, gravitational forces that affect all material objects, including the material object that's talking to you now, the human body. And then there's the discipline of explanation. What counts as a good explanation? What counts as an explanation that we might accept? Where does somebody's explanation have its authority? We also have the capacity to learn from surprise. Most animals are annoyed by things that surprise them. Every now and then we're intrigued by them, and they seem to open up a door from which we see a different kind of light. Quine described man as the creature who invented doubt. That's not quite right. I'm sure dogs do doubt. But what we do is actually cultivate doubt. We cultivate uncertainty. The great French poet Paul Valéry described thought as active uncertainty. So we cultivate all of these things. And behind all this is something we feel probably is unique to human beings, is an ache for a more general, universal sense. What does it all add up to? And behind that, in turn, is the faith that the world will make some kind of overall sense, a belief in the inherent sense of the world, the idea that everything happens for a reason, the principle of sufficient reason. There are two directions, or two dimensions, if you like, to this sense of, or the sense we have that everything makes sense. One is religious and the other is scientific. But what they have in common is a willingness to wait for understanding. In the case of religion, it's the idea of a hidden God, the idea that everything one day will make sense when you see God face to face or whatever. In the case of experimental science, the feeling that we do have partial understanding, a bit more information, a bit more thought, we'll have greater understanding. But there is this willingness to wait. So if we look at a religious approach, there's the notion of the hidden God, that God's perfect intellect ensures that his creation will make sense, that there's an intrinsic intelligibility in the world which God has made in part available to us, we humans who are the favourites of his creation. And using a term that is widespread throughout theology is the notion of the logos of the world, being reflected in the logos of humanity. So that's a profound religious source of the belief that the world makes sense, even if that